Jet Set Radio and Jet Set Radio Future are widely beloved games that don't need any introduction, because their instantly recognizable stylishness does all the speaking. I have only played those games myself for the first time not too long ago, but they left quite an impact on me, making me produce reviews for both of them and continue making fan art, even though I originally never was into skating or hip-hop subculture. What I noticed after getting into Jet Set Radio is that it left a similar impact for many others. It's been over 20 years since the last Jet Set Radio game was released, but I see comments all around about people wanting for another game in the series, folks making fan art pieces, and aspiring game developers who grew up with Jet Set Radio attempting to recreate the magic themselves, because there was nothing that could quite match those games ever since. And Sega seems to have simply abandoned the series. There is another thing I have noticed, however, and it's the thing that this video is all about. Despite its age, Jet Set Radio is still very influential. It has left its mark on the gaming industry, and I started noticing something akin to a revival of its genre. In the past several years, there have been significant attempts to finally reincorporate some of the elements that made Jet Set Radio so appealing into completely new and fresh titles. There are of course smaller indie games that channel similar feel, such as Butterflies or Zenith, which are very obviously taking a lot of inspiration from Jet Set Radio and don't even attempt to hide it. Or something like Sludge Life, which, just like Jet Set Radio, is all about spraying graffitis and climbing weird architectures, but has way different tone and flow. However, as much as I love small indies, this time I'm delving into games with higher budgets that in some shape or form feel like the new wave of Jet Set Radio likes. Yeah. To anyone who has been following similar games to Jet Set Radio, Bomb Rush Cyberfunk is an obvious one, and likely the main reason why you're even watching this video. It's the game that I've been the most hyped for myself this year, and I could easily make a review of Bomb Rush Cyberfunk alone, but many others are doing that already, and I feel like it can be a part of something bigger. Bomb Rush Cyberfunk was made by Team Reptile, who had previously proved themselves more than capable in recreating the unmistakable Jet Set Radio visual style in their previous games. And it honestly feels like Bomb Rush Cyberfunk is the first game that could be considered a proper spiritual sequel to Jet Set Radio. I mean, if you showed screenshots of both games to someone who had never played either one before, they would likely say that it's the same game. And I'm saying that in an absolutely positive way. Of course, the game is even better in motion, and the gameplay? Oh boy, they absolutely nailed it! Both Jet Set Radio games had fairly clunky controls and some general gameplay quirks that stopped them from being 10 out of 10 games. But Bomb Rush Cyberfunk fixes pretty much everything I wanted fixed in Jet Set Radio. The movement is snappy and satisfying, the stickiness of grinding surfaces feels just right, the camera finally works, there are more means of movement than just roller skating, and the graffiti system is my favorite so far. It incorporates a little minigame that makes you draw patterns, each of which correspond to a graffiti, so the player can easily spray any unlocked graffiti instead of having to assign just a couple of unlocked ones and keep spraying the same ones. There is even a dedicated combat system now that allows you to do tricks in order to spin kick cops, but the game still maintains the so important, non-violent nature of a peaceful graffiti rebellion, because none of the enemies get actually killed or seriously injured. Instead, they become targets for graffiti themselves and run back crying to their moms. I enjoy the flow of the gameplay so much, I barely have any complaints. I guess I would like the collectible object hitboxes to be slightly larger, because I would often feel like I should pick things up, yet I don't because I'm only several centimeters off. Some would call it a skill issue though. The one legitimate complaint I have is that the game could really use a restart challenge button, because some late game challenges require you to rack up a ton of points, and if you break your combo midway, you're screwed, and need to wait several more minutes till the timer runs out to attempt the challenge again, because there's no recovery at that point. The story of the game I actually enjoyed quite a bit more than the one in Jet Set Radio. Sure, it's still mostly about gangs rivaling each other and the cops being bad, but it has more going on under the surface. Bomb Rush Cyberfunk has a teeny-weeny darker and more mature vibe. Therefore, it has more emotional moments too, and characterizes its main cast a lot better. I was fully invested in the plot, but being hungry for more of that graffiti skaterpunk action, I was going for all the collectibles and graffitis I could. So that resulted in me playing Bomb Rush Cyberfunk non-stop for several days straight since its release, like it was my job. And as I mentioned already, Bomb Rush Cyberfunk got the Jet Set Radio aesthetic down perfectly, to the point you could mistake the two games for one another. In fact, New Amsterdam feels suspiciously similar to Tokyo though. Some locations feel a ton like the ones in Jet Set Radio Future, as well as the vibes rival gangs give off. The hideout looks nearly identical to the one in Jet Set Radio Future. It's not really a problem, but as much as I want to evaluate Bomb Rush Cyberfunk as its own game, it just has way too many similarities to avoid the Jet Set Radio comparisons. At least the comparisons do Bomb Rush Cyberfunk justice, because it looks beautiful. It has the ageless cartoonish shading and funky beats. The low poly models fit the jagged look of the game just fine. I was a bit more concerned about the texture resolution, because these days it can surely be higher, and the pixelated edges contrast quite a bit with the smooth model outlines. The textures alone make the game feel like it could as well been made 15 years ago, but because of that very reason, it seems like the game can run on nearly any potato without really sacrificing any visual quality. The system requirements provided on Steam are refreshingly low, and the download size is less than 2 GB. Just make sure to have one of them Naganuma compatible sound cards, because the legend himself has come back to provide Bomb Rush Cyberfunk with some fresh tunes. The soundtrack of the game has a collection of pieces from many different artists, and in my opinion, it's actually some of the fresh faces that impress me more than the legendary Hideki Naganuma. Both Jet Set Radio games had some song that just embodied the whole game for me. Humming the bass line being the one for the original Jet Set Radio, and the insanely quotable Concept of Love for Jet Set Radio Future. Both of which were composed by Naganuma, but for Bomb Rush Cyberfunk, I'd say the one track that embodied the essence of the game for me was Operator by Grrrl. There are some other recognizable names like Too Mellow, but I can't say I vibed with all the tracks in the game, as well as I didn't with all of the fashion. Being a more modern game, Bomb Rush Cyberfunk also seems to chase more contemporary trends in hip-hop culture, and I'm simply not a fan of those. But that's purely a matter of taste, because I was never a hip-hop head in the first place. Besides, to be completely honest, I would say Jet Set Radio soundtracks were not flawless with no stinkers either. Fight me! It's just that in my opinion, Bomb Rush Cyberfunk has few too many slow and mellow tracks in its roster, while I prefer the harder hitting hype builders. It doesn't have to be the same exact thing as Jet Set Radio though. This game actually got me messed up, because I hate dancing, yet I would get some of the soundtrack stuck in my head and bust some moves that I would invent myself. I guess even if the beats are not always my thing, real knows real when they feel it. Bomb Rush Cyberfunk is one of the absolute best video game releases of the year for me, and with all my heart I hope for the game's success, and to Sega, a very suck your toes from envy after realizing how much success the turned down Jet Set Radio Evolution could have had. Also, I'm absolutely terrible at doing plugs, but here's one for my coffee page. The summer heat has been absolutely killing my laptop, and it just keeps overheating and blue screening. I'm afraid it can just die, and that would be a big problem. I'm saving up money for a proper desktop, so any donations would be very appreciated. Yeah, thanks for listening to the shameless plug. God damn it, I hate doing this. The next game astonished me with the way it was released. It didn't have any promotional material prior to its release, no artificial hype building, it was released the same day it was announced. It was developed by the studio who brought us the Evil Within series and Ghostwire Tokyo, who are no small fries themselves, but it was also published by heckin' Bethesda, a AAA publisher. On top of that, the game only cost $30 on its release, only half of what's considered a full price by such big studios, and even less than the aforementioned bomb rush Cyberfunk, which released at $40 with the Day 1 DLC. And the game itself is experimental and innovative. Even though marketing-wise, it was like shooting itself in the foot, I was ecstatic seeing such an approach to releasing a game, and not just from some small indie team, mind you. I'm talking about none other than Hi-Fi Rush. Gameplay-wise, Hi-Fi Rush is the most distant game from Jet Set Radio in this video, but it still has plenty of common traits. It has that stylized, flat-shaded cartoony look, it's all about being a punk rocker and taking on evil corpos. Music has always been a huge part of Jet Set Radio, and Hi-Fi Rush takes it to another level. It's a beat-em-up in which everything is synced to the rhythm of the soundtrack. The closest thing to it I played is Crypt of the Necrodancer, and I adore that game. Normally I avoid beat-em-ups, since I'm absolutely terrible at them, but after seeing all the crazy things about Hi-Fi Rush, I just had to try it out. The premise of the game is that Chai is this young dude who wants to be a rock star, but he's just a punk rock loser with a disabled arm. So he went to this big corporation with pretty slogans to get a cybernetic arm instead. He got it, but due to a freak accident he also got this MP3 player sandwich pressed into his heart, thus becoming Chai GPT, and now all his actions have to be synced to the music beat. Instead of becoming a rock star, he was pretty much enslaved by the corporation to work as a trash picker. I mean, how could he be a rockstar with a name that really means tea? Anyway, he was discovered to be a defect due to the MP3 player accident and was ordered to be disposed of. So, it's time to fight the big bad corpos, uncover their hidden evil master plan, and stop it for good. The writing in Hi-Fi Rush is as basic as it can be, but it gets the point across. Its presentation, however, is stellar, and I could easily see Hi-Fi Rush working as a tween cartoon in a similar vein to Avatar: The Last Airbender. The game looks beautiful with its vibrant colors and great animation stylized to imitate that traditional 2D choppy animation. During some cutscenes, it transforms into actual 2D animations and they look great. I love the character designs, the environments are all cool looking, yada yada yada. I could praise the visuals for a while. Let's press on. I had mentioned that gameplay wise, I avoid beat-em-ups or similar action games. My problem is that I'm absolutely terrible at predicting and memorizing enemy move patterns, and I cannot memorize button combos for the life of me. I'd dare say that I'm pretty good at rhythm games however, so I had some hope that I might be decent at Hi-Fi Rush. After all, since everything in the game is synced to music, I wouldn't need to memorize the timing of various actions and such, I would only need to listen to the music. In practice however, I still sucked at the game, because I still have trouble keeping track of all the enemies on screen and their attack patterns. The game is pretty lenient with the timing though, especially on lower difficulties, so not hitting buttons exactly on beat essentially just makes the move take more time to perform, but it will still be performed. And remember how I said Hi-Fi Rush is the most decent game from Jet Set Radio in this video? Well, it might not be that decent from what Jet Set Radio Evolution could have been. I have listened to an interview with one of the developers behind that demo video, and he described that he planned a combat system that sounds nearly exactly to what Hi-Fi Rush uses. Just listen to it.
one of the things that always frustrated me about Jet Set Radio was their combat system. Their combat system was boiled down to spray canning stuff. And that's fine, but it always let me down whenever I was fighting bosses, and the bosses essentially turned into a chase mode, and then you had to spray paint them. And I would get really frustrated just chasing them because all I could do is just spray paint. As frustrated as I was, I couldn't punch them, right? And that's what I wanted to do. I understand, like, there's a general vibe about Jet Set Radio. It's not about the violence. It's none of that. But there's a way to create a combat system that is not overtly violent. So I've always had this idea in my head, again, along with the art style. I just had this combat idea. The combat system was all designed around music. So my idea was to lock down the beats per minute for the soundtrack, faster or slower depending on the tone, but it's always going to be kind of like the same kind of like beat. You can actually be doing tricks and they'll be dancing, break dancing, doing this and that, but they'll hit, and you'll be skating towards enemies, and it's just kind of like magneting you towards enemies. And I'm like, that sounds like fun.
That sounds amazing.
Feels right.
Yeah,
that feels right. You know, you would hit the buttons on the beat for additional multipliers and things like that.
Yeah.
So, you know, you get random chances of knocking people out, unconscious, whatever it is, but it doesn't penalize you if you're not good at hitting the beat. It's just there to guide you. So everything in the music mattered.
I'm not implying it's a stolen idea. Separate people can come up with similar concepts, but the Hi-Fi Rush ended up having a combat system that Jet Set Radio Evolution could have had, and cranked it up to 11. The fights are spaced out with some exploration and platforming sections, which is neat. I loved the way grappling on grinding rails with magnetic hook looked visually. I would want to explore every corner of every level, not to miss any collectibles, of which there are plenty. Some are just currency, which is used to buy upgrades and new fighting moves. Some are permanent upgrades to stats like health. Some are simple consumables. And some are graffitis, which unlock a part of a massive mural with all the main characters. Speaking of upgrades, I was a huge fan of the way the cosmetic customization part was handled, because it's, for whatever reason, only unlocked after beating the main story. I understand that some pre-rendered cinematics use the default skins, so it would be immersion breaking, but I just love collecting cosmetics in games, so I would have enjoyed buying outfits throughout the whole game. There are of course some additional post-ending challenges, but they feel like a bit of a hassle to do, because they require you to replay the story missions with all the cutscenes and dialogues and stuff. There's no free roaming in the Hi-Fi Rush, it's a completely linear game. The presentation is still one of the highest selling points of the game for me. There of course are some odd things here and there, but the game has plenty of pop culture references. The cat companion is adorable, and I absolutely love Chai's junk guitar. Even more than the real guitars he gets, honestly, because it reminds me of the one Igor uses, and that's an absolutely kick-ass look. For a rhythm-based game, a good soundtrack is mandatory, and Hi-Fi Rush delivers in that regard. It has a pretty great original score, but also utilizes some licensed tracks during the more important moments, and those licensed tracks were the highlights of the whole soundtrack for me. I was genuinely surprised hearing multiple 9 Inch Nails tracks in a kid-friendly game, but my favorite addition was Invaders Must Die by The Prodigy. Although I was surprised how many people were first introduced to Prodigy just because of Hi-Fi Rush. It's also a nice addition that the game includes a streamer mode, which replaces the licensed songs with similar sounding original tracks, which cause no issues with the infuriating copyright systems online. So basically, Hi-Fi Rush is mechanically a completely different game from Jet Set Radio, but it understands the importance of its presentation and utilizes it for something that doesn't feel derivative whatsoever. It's a very refreshing breeze in the higher budget video game market.
Honorable mentions.
I had already mentioned some neat tiny games in this video's introduction, but there are still some bigger games that have similarities to Jet Set Radio, but didn't quite cut it for this video. I had reviewed Neon White last year, and I still consider it my favorite game of the year. Back then, it really scratched my itch for something in a similar vein to Jet Set Radio. It had very smooth and satisfying movement-based gameplay and amazing music composed by Machine Girl. But I had already made a separate video for that game, and thematically it's pretty far from Jet Set Radio. There is another game, however, that aims to replicate the feel of Jet Set Radio, and I only discovered it pretty late to this video's production. It's called Hover, or rather, Hover Revolt of Gamers, but it's quite untasteful, including a slur in the title if you ask me. Hover made an earnest attempt at a movement-based game about rebelling against the government, much like Jet Set Radio, but with a decent amount of differences too. Hover is a lot more sci-fi themed, littered with gamer peripheral style LEDs, both in architecture and character design. The thing that drew me into the game the most is that it actually has several songs in the soundtrack that are composed by Jet Set Radio's Hideki Naganuma. That's guaranteed to be a blast. This game, however, didn't quite cut it for me, because it just didn't feel like it understood what made Jet Set Radio great. I simply don't have much to compliment. Hover's controls feel floaty. Character designs remind me of off-brand cereal boxes, and the level design feels a bit directionless. The game feels like it was designed more like an MMO, with random quest givers scattered throughout the map, and a way weaker narrative. The gist of it is that the government is bad and prohibits any fun, and gamers have to rebel against it. Being called the G-slur constantly in the game put me off quite a bit. It felt like the writing severely lacked self-awareness. I might have enjoyed that game when I was 13 and if it was a free-to-play MMO, but as it is now at $20 price tag, it doesn't quite match up to the other games in this video. Sunset Overdrive was a pleasant surprise to me. I remember it making some buzz when it originally came out, but it quickly died down and the game fell into obscurity. It's the most violent game in this list, being a third-person zombie shooter, which is not aimed at a younger audience whatsoever, but it retains a lot of Jet Set Radio's DNA. Sunset Overdrive's main gimmick is the movement system, which allows you to grind rails, wall run, and do all sorts of that kind of thing. On top of it, it's as punk aesthetically as a game can get. That's a bit of a departure from the hip-hop style, but punk is infinitely closer to me, and it still makes the plot still be about various misfits taking down a ridiculous evil corporation. Sunset Overdrive is an open-world game with fun and fluid movement and a ton of collectibles. I enjoy playing games of this kind from time to time. It's pretty much the Assassin's Creed formula, but refreshed in a way that doesn't make my eyes roll at the thought that it's the same game yet again. The plethora of collectibles scattered throughout the game's map actually has meaning, because they work as currencies to buy and upgrade the wacky makeshift weapons and abilities. Missions have various objectives, most elaborate of which is base defense, where you need to utilize various traps and hold off hordes of monsters, orcs must die style. The game's fast travel system is surprisingly immersive and in character too, just getting wasted on booze and waking up in a different spot. But I would barely even do that because just making my way through the city, doing stunts, exploring and collecting items is so much fun. The game has its share of jank, but it doesn't detract anything from enjoyability for me because it still plays very smooth. The premise of the game's story is that the evil Fisco Corporation has released a new drink in Sunset City, which ended up making everyone who drinks it into grotesque mutants. So the few survivors have to both survive the totally not zombie apocalypse and stop Fisco from doing anything worse. Throughout the game, the player has to unite various different groups of ridiculous characters, all of which I actually found enjoyable to listen to, in order to stop the mutation-inducing drinks from spreading. I can see the game's writing not suiting everyone, but if you can handle Borderlands style of over-the-top jokes, you'll be able to handle this game. With the way how ridiculous the game is, and is self-aware about it, I didn't mind the humor quite as much. I could even appreciate the fourth wall-breaking jokes. It's a punk game after all, it cannot be contained by any rules. Sunset Overdrive is already several years old, but in my opinion its stylized graphics are aging very well so far, and the soundtrack of it is amazing. I enjoyed every single track. The soundtrack has been put together by many different punk bands, most of which I didn't recognize, but then there's the motherfucking Melvins with a cameo from Buzz Osborne himself. That kind of thing made me feel like Sunset Overdrive is to punk rock what Brutal Legend is to heavy metal. And there would be silly things in the soundtrack itself, like one of the songs being straight up about diarrhea. The music aside, I love the visual style of the game. Seeing the annoying looking dude on the game's cover, I expected worse, because I thought I would be stuck playing as him. But it turned out that the game has amazing character customization. If usually in video games I would dislike most cosmetic options, and would just have a couple that I could tolerate, in Sunset Overdrive I found the fashion so good that I would love nearly every single clothing article, and would have trouble picking what I like the most. Good thing the player can change their looks at any time. In fact, the protagonist in Sunset Overdrive is the most gender-fluid protagonist I've seen in gaming, because regardless of gender, you can equip them with absolutely any clothing or haircuts, even if it means giving ladies mustaches or putting dudes in miniskirts. Based. On top of it, you can change your body type at any time too, and the character would even comment that it was the easiest sex change ever, so all of that is canon. That sort of freedom is punk as heck. I would absolutely love just playing dressed up in Sunset Overdrive. All of the NPCs also have vibrant personalities. The game board looks nice, it's just a bit weird seeing some TVs with some random real-life dude talking.
Hello and welcome to Sunset TV.
But whatever. I had a great time with Sunset Overdrive, there's very little to complain about. I guess it's a bit of a shame that the PC version dropped the multiplayer functionality. Having a dialogue skip option would also be nice, because some voice lines can either be annoying or just repeat way too much as an introduction to a main plot quest. Other than that, the game is a ton of fun to play, and while it's not exactly like Jet Set Radio, it is something fresh that still lets you see the Jet Set Radio influence to even AAA games. And there you go. If you are still having an itch for something that has similar vibes to Jet Set Radio, there's a ton of stuff you can play these days that both recreate nearly the exact same feel, and things that feel a lot more fresh and original. I know there are rumors about Sega finally doing something with Jet Set Radio, but there's still the fact that they had abandoned the IP for 2 decades so far. So it's real nice seeing the old games still inspiring fans and game developers alike. I hope you find this video interesting, thank you for watching, and see you in another video.